In 1992, The Last of the Mohicans was released, and it was really a breath of fresh air. Rather than retelling the American Revolution for the umpteenth time, it focuses on the 7 Years' War called the French Indian War by people in the United States. While this conflict was certainly a precursor to the American Revolution, the film weaves in multiple narratives to tell the story of Nathaniel Hawkeye Poe, his adoptive Mohican family, and their attempts to save two British women from the French and Hurons during the conflict. If you want to know more about the languages used in the film, how the French are portrayed, or an overall review of the plot, check out Craig's video over at NBS History, who is graciously helping me review this movie. The link is in the description and in the title card above. For now, I want to examine some of the broader themes of the film and where they fit into history. Number 1. Should Hawkeye be white? Hollywood throughout history has had a major problem with a phenomenon known as whitewashing. Whitewashing is basically injecting white actors or characters into stories that should otherwise be portrayed by or about people of color. This film, while detailing the bloodshed and tragedy of Mohicans, Mohawks, and Huron Native Americans, may raise some eyebrows by featuring a white protagonist. While the film is based off James Fenimore Cooper's 1826 work of the same name, and racial sensitivity may not have been in the public zeitgeist at the time, modern scholarship has done a lot to show that Creole families on the so-called frontier were very much a thing. In the many captivities of Esther Wheelwright, we see the story of a young British girl who was captured and raised by Native Americans and then hostage to the French. She became the mother superior of a convent, but her contemporaries were very aware of her incredibly diverse background and upbringing. The book goes on to explain that Esther wasn't that unique, and that Native Americans would adopt other children, including whites, through capture, trade, or taking in refugees. This means that Hawkeye being raised by Mohicans as their white son is very in line with life in the borderlands between the English, French, Spanish, and Native Americans. Marriage between peoples for the purposes of trade or military alliances was also incredibly common. Hyde's Empires, Nations, and Families explores how these frontiers weren't just empty wilderness, but rather the confluence of these peoples and the location of Creolized societies. For those who don't know, Creole usually denotes a mixture of different groups of people, both ethnically and linguistically. She has multiple different case studies of Americans and colonial men giving up white families to marry Native Americans for trade or political reasons. Hawkeye being white but raised and loved by Native Americans seems very in line with what we know about this era. Number 2, the role of information in news. Much of the story focuses on Hawkeye, Uncas, and Chingachgook escorting the daughters of Colonel Munro to the besieged Fort William Henry. The middle of the film is all about the plight of the fort being cut off by the Hurons and the French. Colonel Munro finds out from Hawkeye and Hayward about multiple events in the film, including the destruction of colonial homesteads, the fact that Webb and his men are only 12 miles away, and that the British group with Hawkeye and Major Hayward was ambushed after their guide, the Huron warrior Magua, had led them into a trap. While the use of native guides and news from natives may seem like a trope, this was very in line with the colonial experience. Alejandra Dubcovsky's book, Informed Power, talks about how news and trail guides were important resources used by Native Americans in their interactions with the Europeans. From the 1500s even into the 1700s, Europeans, being so far removed from their homelands and often from their sister colonies, needed the information and travel networks run and maintained by natives to stay informed and connected to one another. News and guides through trail networks was one of the biggest items that the natives used to leverage trade and alliances with the Europeans. That the British could need natives to guide them and need natives to inform them of events even 12 miles away is pretty close to what we know about the power of news. While Magua and the Hurons' tale of revenge against Colonel Munro is a big part of the plot and requires the British to trust him at first, this isn't just plot contrivance. Europeans really did rely on the natives in this way. Number 3, Native American agency. Another thing that this movie gets right is that it depicts Native Americans as having agency. Usually Native Americans are depicted through various tropes. One of the most famous is the noble savage, where they are shown as being primitive but peaceful and harmonious. While Native Americans more or less had their civilizations destroyed by the Columbian Exchange, many depictions show them as helpless victims. The line between victim and helpless is one that many films, books, and other media don't tread very well. As explained in the earlier sections, Native Americans had their own agendas, and they were very adept at manipulating news, trails, trade, and military strategies in order to leverage beneficial alliances with Europeans and colonists. The film shows natives fighting with firearms and pursuing their own objectives.
Magwa's village and lodges were burnt. Magwa's children were killed by the English. And his heart will be whole again on the day the gray hair and all his seed are dead.
The Mohawk and Mohicans fight with the British because they view it as their best route for trade and protection against their Huron enemies. Magua and the Hurons view the French as the best route for revenge against the British. The natives are power brokers and active participants, and this film doesn't treat them like helpless infants. While the ending is tragic for the Mohicans made a conscious choice in their alliance and their duty to protect the Munro girls. Number 4. American Grievances in the French-Indian War. While I applauded this film for not just being about the American Revolution, the fact is that the movie does allude to the colonial sentiments and splits with the British that would manifest themselves in the American Revolution. From early on, the colonists and Major Hayward butt heads in the role of the militia for the British military. The colonists argue that they will only fight if their terms are met, namely that they can go home to their farms in the event of raids against their families.
Speak for the men, not command them. If they're not allowed leave to defend their farms and families if the French attack the settlements, then no colonial militia is going to the Fort William Henry.
Hayward argues that they are members of the British Crown and should behave as subjects and not as equals.
These colonials get them to do anything. Tiring, isn't it? But that's the lay of the land.
I thought British policy is make the world England.
While the British eventually agreed to their terms, later in the film we see this clash come up once again. The militia is fighting in Fort William Henry under Colonel Munro when Hawkeye's party brings news of the burnout homesteads in the Huron raids against the colonists. Despite the prior agreement, Hayward lies about the raids and Munro refuses to release the militia. This leads to Hawkeye helping the militia sneak out against orders, and then he gets arrested and is about to be executed. This Crown versus colonist problem, which is heavily focused on the idea of how much independence and autonomy the colonists should have, is definitely an allusion to the American Revolution.
Their law no longer has rightful authority over us. All they have over us then is tyranny. And I will not live under that yoke.
The end of the French-Indian War and the debt that it brought also led to a marked British economic interest in the colonies. In an attempt to recoup the debt, the British increasingly taxed and regulated colonial life, greatly influencing patriot sentiments and the start of the American Revolution. Number 5. Overall impressions. While the film may not get every detail correct and it does have its nitpicks, it captures the general spirit of the era. Native Americans have agency and are active participants in the war and the policies. News and pathing are important aspects of the European empires attempting to control their territory. Hawkeye's adoptive family and the Creole citizens throughout the film do capture family realities in the borderlands between the different civilizations in North America. The way the British and colonists react also hints towards the future issues that would crop up in the American Revolution. Overall, I highly recommend this film if you have any interest in this era, and it does do a great job at giving the general feel of how things were. It's also a compelling drama with some real human emotions, great acting, beautiful score, and really neatly choreographed fight scenes. If you have any interest in the French-Indian War, then this is the film for you. Thank you everyone for watching. Remember to check out Craig's review at NBS History. What are your thoughts on the film? Leave a comment and let me know what you think. Like and subscribe if you want more historical film reviews, and as always, stay excited about history.